Ethics in management and entrepreneurship is an important discussion that we should have because you'll note that there will be individuals out there that will do a variety of things to get business. Sometimes they'll do it unethically, and then sometimes they'll conduct business using good ethics. So, what is ethics? Well, it all comes down to what's right and wrong. And we had a professor once who said, well, it's what you learn from family, from friends, from the people that you operate in their circles. It may come from your religion. It may come from your family inner circles on what your ethics is. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about what's right and wrong. It involves really character and the conduct of individuals and institutions. There's a level of integrity involved when it comes to ethics. Some people would say ethics is what you do when you think no one is watching. Okay? So let's say, for instance, you think no one's watching and you decide to do an assignment, but you take someone else's work. Well, that's unethical, and it lacks academic integrity when you do that. And you can't steal somebody's work without giving them recognition. You need to recognize and identify who the individuals are where you've received information. Ethics is your own understanding of acceptable behaviors based upon principles and rules that one considers important. Oftentimes in our business world, we will have a code of ethics. And this code of ethics, in our area, you might have the National Association of Broadcasters Code of Ethics. You might have the Broadcast Education Association's Code of Ethics. You might have the Society of Professional Journalists Ethics. You might have the Graphic Communications Code of Ethics. And one of the things that you have to recognize is that codes of ethics are set up in some cases to avoid law. And there are many organizations out there, professionals out there, who operate within a guiding set of principles called the Code of Ethics. They do so because it is a boundary line in essence, and it says don't walk over this boundary or you'll be classified as unethical. And if you do that, there's a chance that you could also wind up being illegal in the process, and that comes down sometimes to slander and libel. And so there are principles that we must hold dear to us. Ethics describe moral value of an individual or a group and yields positive influences on society. You guys, we have to have some ethical behavior. We have to operate in a moral way in order for what we would call a democratic society to work. Ethics is the discipline of dealing with what is morally right or wrong, good or bad. There are ethical systems that will describe the critical process of how we work through moral issues. And then we have values, and those are those accepted principles or standards of an individual or a group. All decision making involves values, which reflect on our presuppositions about social life and human nature. Values are also what an individual or group estimates or evaluates as worthwhile. So, a value that you might have or your ethical duties in mass media could be held to be these three areas. You have an ethical duty in the mass media to yourself and your career objectives. You have an ethical duty to the audience or subscriber. You also have an ethical duty to your employer or organization. You have an ethical duty to other professional colleagues, and you have an ethical duty to society. Hopefully, you have your own personal code of ethics, and you don't follow someone else's code of ethics. So, let's use college. You go to college, you've always lived under the umbrella of your parents. And you get to college, and parents aren't there. So, you can do you can go in a multitude of directions. But one direction you can go is the direction of considering yourself and your own personal career goals and objectives. And you go, okay, I can not go to class, not do the homework, not take the test, not study, and I'll be okay. But it's really not very ethical to yourself to do that, because then you can't obtain the career objectives that you have. And sometimes it takes a student 2 or 3 semesters to figure that one out. Then you have an ethical duty to your audience. We create content and intellectual property. So we have a responsibility to the audience, whether they're reading it or whether they're hearing it. We have a responsibility. We also, if we wind up whether you're an entrepreneur or you're employed by someone else, you have an ethical responsibility to the organization in which you work. And you've been in positions where you've worked in places where someone might get there a little late, might leave a little early, might not follow just the necessary code of behavior at that workplace, and that's an ethical issue. You also have an ethical duty to professional colleagues, not just in your organization, but to others around you, because if you come across as not doing your job well, it's a reflection on the entire profession as a whole. And so you have to be very careful about that. And then you have an ethical duty to society. And this is the big picture, you guys. This is a real thing. This is not you. It's not your employer. It's the future that you have an ethical responsibility to. So, how do you make the decisions on what is appropriate behavior? Well, there's different moral decision-making tools that are out there. One of them is the golden mean. And in the golden mean, basically it's do unto others as others would do unto you. Emphasizes moderation and avoids extremes and deficiencies. Whereas the Judeo-Christian ethic is respect all people based on a universal love for God and consider how the decision would impact others. And a lot of people use that particular one in Christian societies. You may see that, and that's just considered an ethical, moral decision-making process is using that particular principle there. You also have the categorical imperative decision-making process. And in that one, it emphasizes the moral duty and is concerned more with the process of making an ethical decision than the outcome. So did you go through the steps of making that decision? And a lot of organizations have steps for you to go through. And you'll find those inside lots of employee handbooks. These are the things that you should do, and these are expectations we have, and this is your duty to do it, and then we have the outcomes. There's another moral decision-making method, and that's utilitarianism. This one is whatever makes the most people happy for the greatest number of people, and it's concerned more with the consequences of an ethical decision than the process itself. So whereas categorical imperative was concerned with the process and the steps you took to make the decision, utilitarianism was concerned with the consequences of the ethical decision, not the process. You got to remember, sometimes, you guys, making everybody happy is not the best way to go. You have egalitarianism, and that's where everyone must be treated fairly and equally. And you kind of put on this veil of ignorance, which allows you to make decisions that are impartial, and you don't have these cultural biases that exist out there. Because we all have cultural bias. I mean, we just can't help ourselves. But if you take on the armor of the egalitarianism, you could use a veil of ignorance. Basically, you're removing yourself from the situation, and you're making it unbiased. Relativism is really situational ethics. In our business, I wouldn't operate off of situational ethics very much myself. And each individual decides what's best and doesn't judge other people's decisions. That one there, if you're in a corporate setting, does not take into account all the people that are impacted by the decision. So that's a tough one for me to see as a good idea. We also have what we call social responsibility. And with social responsibility, basically the moral decisions serve social needs and the impacts on society should be considered. So here in our country, a lot of our decision making kind of comes down to social responsibility. We have a certain responsibility to the people around us, and we really think about the outcomes of those decisions. Deontological, I should say, and teleological ethics. This is a process of moral decision making. You examine the intent and motives of the actions. And guys, not everybody has good intent. So, and not everybody has good motivations. So these two tools here are not necessarily what I would say are the best. The teleological ethics stresses the consequences of decision making and strives to produce the best possible decisions through an examination of each alternative and its impact on others. We have a variety of values that exist. And we have professional values, and those come down to things that are closer to home for us, proximity-wise. We like recency. These are professional values if we're involved in any kind of journalism. If we're involved in any kind of media, we're interested in entertainment values, thoroughness, independence, watchdog category, public's right to know. Those are all important elements to the types of values that we deal with. We have moral values, which comes down to telling the truth, humanness, justice and fairness, freedom, independence, good stewardship of money, honesty, nonviolence, commitment and self-control, all elements of moral values. We also have aesthetic values. What's pleasing to the eye, what's imaginative, what's creative, what's harmonious for the rest of society. We have logical values, consistency, whether we're competent, whether we're knowledgeable of the content in which we're actually talking about. And then we have sociocultural values, thrift, frugalness, in other words, hard work, being energetic, having restraint. Heterosexuality is a social cultural value that has changed significantly. This particular slide was created some time back. It's been a value that's been very important to the United States. With the ruling in 2015 by the U.S. Supreme Court, we now have said through law, not necessarily through values, but through law and the interpretation by the United States Supreme Court, that homosexuality is a socio-cultural value that exists now. It's not on the screen, but I'm just telling you that it is now classified, homosexuality is classified as a socio-cultural value. All right. Then we have, and we can't really see this very well, so I'm not sure how I'm going to do this, but over here we have definitions. And these are the definitions of the situation. And then we have the values that we apply, and those are the ones that I just talked about. These are the values that we have. And then we have our loyalties. And in our loyalties, we're talking about the organizations that we work for, loyalties to ourselves, loyalties to professional colleagues, and that sort of thing, and loyalty to society, and loyalty to the public. And then we have the principles. And the guiding principles are these elements back here. These are guiding principles that you might use in making decisions about any kind of moral decision making that you might have. So from the golden mean to the Judeo-Christian ethic, to the categorical imperative, utilitarianism, egalitarianism. I can't spit that out well enough, but I'm not going to go back and change that because you can see how it's spelled. Relativism, situational ethics is what that is. Social responsibility, which is often very prevalent here in the United States. We have deontological ethics and we have teleological ethics. And then the values that I mentioned. And then it gets us to these 4 dimensions. So definitions, values, loyalties, and principles. All a part of the decision-making process. So, then we're faced with ethical issues. And you'll have opportunities in class at some point to walk through the process of ethical decision making, and you may be asked to address ethical decision making as part of your final exam questions that you have. And so that does it for ethics in management.